Josefina Lopez explained to me that she was making figures for cards that would be shown to kids doing yoga, and I immediately imagined something shaped kind of like this, but when she presented it, she just stuck with the A4 format. Although I loved the drawings, really charming, I was a little disappointed by the cropping, and I realized I hadn't really talked about cropping much in class. So that's the reason for this video. I just think they would have worked much better as cards, shaped like this and about this big on the shape. And here's another example of cropping. Catherine Dimai did this little sketch outside school. There's a canal there, and in the canal, quite often, there's a little book-selling boat, which is a little quirky and charming and interesting to draw. When she was developing her drawing, I noticed that she again was using a standard format. She had some empty space at the bottom. She had a little bit of a ragged, weak edge at the side here, and I found that this fellow here a little bit distracting and suggested that she think about cropping it. And this was the final project. And to me, it's much more focused, much more interesting, focused on the main subject matter. There's a lot less empty space, fits more nicely on the page. It's just more interesting to look at, including the dog without the guy's head. Somehow that becomes a slightly amusing counterpoint to the main theme. So think about cropping. Photoshop has a crop tool, and it works quite simply. Click and drag, and the lighter portion is what's going to be left after cropping. You can adjust your initial selection by pushing these tabs. And the really great thing about the way this works in recent versions of Photoshop is once you've cropped, you haven't lost what's beyond the crop line. You could come back with the crop tool and boink, see, everything's still there. Now, in older versions of Photoshop, that's not true. Once you've cropped, it's gone. If you're using an older version of Photoshop, be careful about that. It would make sense to make an additional copy of your file with a new name and work on that when cropping, so you don't lose something that you later decide you want to include. Okay? Should you always crop? No, not at all. First, give some thought to the nature of your image. This editorial illustration by Amy Petter about the Bedbug Olympics really relies on the heroic scale to create the humor in it. You've got this operatic cast of characters, gods booming in the sky. Cropping it would just rob it of its glory, and that's really the essence of its humor, too. Natasha Wigater allowed space around her character here, who was supposed to represent somebody fearful in a public transportation setting, and that helps to add to the sense of vulnerability of the character. Now, normally, if you're doing a job, you'll be given a size for your illustration, and let's say in this case the size you'd been given was as shown here. You still have a lot of flexibility by enlarging or reducing or changing the placement of your subject. So you could have this or this or this and still be working to the same format size, or even this. And here's someone who did something like that, Reddy Desai. Very interesting composition. I think Reddy had this layout in mind when she began. So that would be more of a case of framing her image rather than cropping. But in either case, framing or cropping, experiment a bit. Your subject need not always be front and center. Now here's an example by Gwyneth McNamara, a series. I feel this is a very intimate view of the subject matter by the way she's chosen to crop it. We're almost among the elements in the composition. The third image she made, her proximity is much further away from the subject matter, and I think she's lost some of that. Could you have an intimate view of cacti? Maybe. I just threw this together. Be a little more consistent with the other two. But really beautiful, sensitive work. Gwyneth, thank you for that. Erica Nachmia did this study of fantasy dragons and cropped them. I think it's just great. I really like the way the parts of the figures intersect the edges of the image, and the negative spaces created are quite interesting. Sometimes just a matter of taste or personal preference. Steffi Boiano included a lot of stuff in this music venue reportage. Maybe it could have just been a little less. Sometimes having a little less in one image makes it a little easier to take it all in. Next, we're going to talk about tightening up, which is a little different, which has to do with how far away things are from each other in an image. Anna Hill did this scary study back on the subject of fear on public transport. But I feel she just had too big of a framework. I think it's effective. I like the shadows, and it is scary, but maybe we just get a little distracted by the size of it. So I think this could have been maybe half the size. But good job. You saw this image by Wei Hang in a previous video. Yep, she's a student. I didn't mention that at the time. The others were all professionals. And I remember, as I was talking about this, I felt it kind of wandered off to the left here. I think there's just a bit too much out there that's detracting from the main focus. So tightening up or pushing things together is a way to avoid that. Here's a second study of the same elements, and by pushing them in, we get a little more emphasis on the main focus. Also, in editorial work, a lot of times you don't have a huge amount of space, so you have to be efficient with what you're doing. Joanna Marl was working in portrait format on her little narrative about transforming an old IKEA bar cart. And things were getting kind of spread around and pushed apart because of the format. So we rotated the canvas and rearranged things. And then the story was pretty clear. A plus B equals C. So think about the shape and the orientation of what you're working on, especially if you're working on it for yourself and you don't have any set dimensions to stick to. Hannah Shipton did this beautiful composition of perfume and makeup articles, and boy, she really crowded them together, and I think that's part of its charm and its strength. A lot of white space left over, which, again, in your portfolio, you could certainly show something like this. In published illustration, you'd see this kind of thing more with advertising, where the art director might have decided that the white space would help sell the product. It's less likely in editorial. Should you always tighten up? No. Here's an image by Kate Volica, which is moody. Tells a bit of a story about a lonely-looking gent who seems to have nothing in his life but his dog. Of course, if you pushed all the stuff in that together and cropped it, you wouldn't have that story, would you? So, yeah, sometimes you have to think about the functionality of the open space. Is it helping you tell your story, or is it a distraction? Finally, a couple of other things. Sometimes you can look in a project you're working on, pick something out. Linda Newcomb pulled this one flying ant out of her composition and realized it had a standalone quality of its own. You could find something very special among a bunch of stuff you're working on and just display it by itself. Kind of in the opposite direction, you could also, if you had a series of images, you could put several images together. And here, Joey Petit has done that, and I think it works pretty well. Steph Flynn did it all with her series, and both think effective presentation. Sarah Cooper had 3 little fashion sketches. She decided to make them appear as though they were on Polaroids, pasted on a wall during a fashion shoot. So, nice little presentation technique. But essentially, in these cases, we're talking about pulling a series of separate illustrations into one image, which can work quite well. Scott Gazzard did this book cover way back at the beginning of the class. I was really happy with this, with the composition on the page, the cropping, very strong, very bold, and the lettering, hand lettering, cool. I have one small issue with it, and some kind of thing you should look out for. The lettering, which I like, just happens to cover up one of the eyes of the animal. Be careful for things like that. Eyes are the window to the soul. But keep your stuff on layers, because that'll let you move things around later. If let's say, a publisher came back to you and said, "We love it, but we'd like to see the animal's eyes." Looking ahead, please be aware of the scope of what you're including in an image. and that you can modify that. Remember, content need not always be front and center. Use the edges of your work creatively, and consider how close or separated elements in your composition should be. Experiment with the shape or orientation of an image. Do try the crop tool, and best luck with your work. Regarding the illustrations in this video, I may have made suggestions, but all are really top-notch work. I love these images dearly, and I'm so happy they were made by students in my classes.